The unnatural silence. There are places on Earth where sound behaves strangely. In deep forests, echoes stretch longer than they should. In narrow valleys, whispers travel farther than expected. But hidden among remote mountains, there exists a place where sound does not return at all. At first glance, the cave looks ordinary. A dark opening carved into ancient stone, surrounded by wind-swept trees and sharp cliffs. Mist drifts slowly across its entrance, as if the mountain itself is breathing. Yet something feels wrong the moment you stand before it. The wind moves the leaves, but you hear nothing. Your footsteps touch the ground, but no echo follows. Even your own breathing seems distant, as though the air is swallowing every vibration before it can reach your ears. People who have visited the site describe an overwhelming sense of pressure, not on the body, but on the mind. The silence is not peaceful. It is heavy, unnatural, almost deliberate. When someone speaks near the entrance, their voice simply disappears into the darkness, leaving behind a hollow stillness that feels wider than the cave itself. Local hikers were the first to notice the anomaly. They expected the familiar bounce of sound against stone walls, the comforting reassurance that space could be measured by echo. Instead, their shouts were erased instantly, as if cut from reality. Some reported feeling disoriented, even dizzy, after only a few moments near the opening. Birds refused to fly overhead. Insects avoided the rocks. Nature itself seemed to recognize the absence of something essential. Scientists later attempted to explain the phenomenon with acoustic theory and geological models. They spoke of sound absorption, unusual mineral density, and rare atmospheric conditions. But none of these explanations could account for the complete and absolute disappearance of sound. Not weakened, not distorted, gone. Standing before the cave, one question becomes impossible to ignore. Silence is often described as empty, a lack of activity, a harmless void. But here, the silence feels full. It feels occupied. It feels as though something unseen is listening, waiting, consuming every vibration that dares to enter its domain. This is not the absence of sound. This is the presence of something else. Discovery of the silent cave. The cave was not discovered by scientists, satellites, or specialized instruments. It revealed itself quietly, almost accidentally, to a small group of hikers searching for a new trail through a remote mountain range rarely marked on modern maps. The region was known for its harsh weather, unstable rock formations, and unpredictable fog that could swallow entire valleys in minutes. Few people ventured there without a clear purpose, and fewer still stayed long enough to explore its deeper terrain. Late one afternoon, as the light faded behind the peaks, the hikers noticed a narrow opening between two towering stone walls. Moss clung to the rocks like frozen shadows, and a thin stream of cold air flowed outward, carrying the scent of damp earth and ancient stone. Curious, one of them stepped closer and clapped his hands, expecting the familiar echo that caves always returned. Nothing came back. No rebound. No fading ripple of sound. Just a sudden, unsettling silence that felt heavier than the surrounding air. At first they laughed, assuming the wind had swallowed the noise or their ears had momentarily failed them. One hiker shouted into the opening. Another whistled sharply. A third stomped his boot against the rock. Still nothing. The sound simply vanished the moment they crossed the threshold of darkness. The hikers exchanged uneasy glances. Every natural instinct told them that enclosed stone should reflect sound easily, even violently. Echoes were predictable, comforting, a way for humans to understand space. But this place refused to respond. As they stood closer to the entrance, subtle details began to feel wrong. The wind brushed against their jackets, yet they could barely hear it. Loose gravel shifted under their boots without its usual crunch. Even their own breathing sounded distant and muffled, as if someone had placed invisible walls between their ears and the world. One hiker described the sensation later as standing inside a vacuum that still contained air. Another said it felt like being underwater without the pressure or resistance, only the eerie absence of sound. They did what most curious explorers would do. They recorded the moment on their phones. The video footage showed them laughing nervously, shouting toward the darkness, snapping fingers, clapping loudly. The visual reactions were clear: open mouths, exaggerated gestures, puzzled expressions. But when the footage was replayed later, the audio track dropped into near total silence whenever the camera pointed toward the cave entrance. Their voices faded abruptly, cut off mid-wave, as though erased by an invisible boundary. When the hikers shared the video online, many dismissed it as a glitch, an editing trick, or microphone failure. But a few viewers noticed something unsettling. The audio distortion always followed the same invisible line in the frame, precisely where the cave's shadow began. Encouraged by growing curiosity, the hikers returned the next day with simple tools: a handheld speaker, a whistle, metal objects to strike against the rock. They placed the speaker near the entrance and played loud music. The sound was audible behind them, but the moment the speaker was angled toward the cave, the music dropped sharply, collapsing into nothing. Even stranger, when they tossed small stones into the darkness, they could see the stones bouncing and rolling, but they heard no impact, no collision, no echo. The cave accepted movement, but rejected sound. News spread quickly among local communities, hikers, and amateur researchers. Some believed it was a natural acoustic anomaly caused by rare mineral absorption. Others suspected hidden tunnels that trapped sound waves. A few joked that the cave was cursed or haunted. But humor faded when more visitors began reporting similar sensations: dizziness, pressure in the ears, a strange sense of being watched when standing too close. Wildlife behavior raised further concern. Birds altered their flight paths to avoid crossing above the cave entrance. Insects clustered away from the stone walls, as if repelled by an unseen field. Even small animals left no tracks near the opening, despite abundant food sources nearby. A local guide who had spent decades navigating the mountains refused to approach the site after hearing the recordings. He claimed the silence was wrong, not like natural quiet, but like something actively removing noise from the air. Mountains always speak, he said. Rocks crack, wind whispers, snow shifts. If a place makes everything mute, it doesn't want to be found. Eventually, the footage reached a small university research group specializing in environmental acoustics. Intrigued by the consistency of the anomaly, they contacted the hikers and requested access to the location and raw recordings. Initial audio analysis confirmed that the sound loss was not caused by compression, hardware malfunction, or digital interference. The waveform simply collapsed into flat lines whenever the camera faced the cave interior. The researchers attempted to simulate the effect in laboratory conditions using soundproof materials and vibration-absorbing structures. Nothing came close. Even the most advanced acoustic chambers still reflected trace frequencies and residual noise. Absolute silence, especially in open air, was considered practically impossible. Yet the cave appeared to produce exactly that. When the research team finally visited the site themselves, they experienced the phenomenon firsthand. Professional microphones captured ambient forest noise clearly, birds' distant wind, shifting branches, until they were slowly rotated toward the cave entrance. Then the sound dissolved as if fading into a void. No echo returned, no atmospheric noise lingered. The silence felt thick, pressing against perception itself. Several team members reported mild headaches and disorientation after prolonged exposure. One researcher noted a subtle sense of spatial confusion, as though depth and distance became harder to judge without sound cues. Human senses, designed to triangulate reality using echo and vibration, suddenly lacked one of their most reliable anchors. What began as a curious hiking discovery was now becoming something far more troubling. The cave was not merely quiet, it was actively erasing sound, and no one yet understood why. When technology fails. The first full-scale scientific expedition to the silent cave arrived quietly, without media attention or public announcements. The research team understood that extraordinary claims required careful verification, not spectacle. Their goal was simple: determine whether the cave's apparent sound disappearance was a measurable physical phenomenon or merely a psychological illusion amplified by expectation and faulty recording devices. They brought equipment normally reserved for deep geological mapping and acoustic testing in extreme environments. High-sensitivity microphones capable of detecting vibrations below human hearing. Directional speakers calibrated to emit precise frequency sweeps, ground-penetrating radar to map subsurface structures, and most importantly, advanced sonar units designed to construct three-dimensional images by analyzing reflected sound waves. In controlled conditions, sonar rarely failed. Even in underwater trenches, dense urban tunnels, and volcanic caverns, sound always returned in some form. Reflection was a fundamental behavior of waves interacting with matter. The cave, however, challenged that assumption the moment the equipment was powered on. The first test was simple. A directional speaker was positioned 5 meters from the cave entrance, aimed directly into the darkness. A calibrated pulse sequence was transmitted, ranging from low-frequency rumbles to high-pitched ultrasonic bursts. The microphones behind the speaker recorded the outgoing wave perfectly, but nothing came back. No echo signature, no scatter pattern, no residual reverberation. The returning channel remained completely flat, as if the signal had never existed beyond its point of emission. Technicians recalibrated the instruments, suspecting alignment errors or software misreads. The test was repeated from different angles and distances. The result was identical every time. Sound entered the cave and vanished without leaving any detectable trace. Next came the sonar units. Normally, sonar creates a spatial map by timing how long sound waves take to bounce back from surrounding surfaces. The cave should have produced immediate reflections from nearby rock walls. Instead, the sonar display showed an empty void extending far beyond the cave's visible depth, a blank volume with no definable boundaries. Engineers adjusted sensitivity levels, amplification thresholds, and signal strength. At maximum output, the sonar should have overwhelmed any absorbing material. Instead, the screen remained eerily empty. The cave registered as a hole in acoustic space, an absence where data should exist. One researcher compared it to pointing a camera into a mirrorless darkness that refused to reflect light, except this darkness consumed sound itself. Suspecting electromagnetic interference or environmental anomalies, the team deployed auxiliary sensors. Temperature remained stable. Air pressure showed minor natural fluctuations. Radiation levels were normal. Magnetic readings showed no significant distortion. There was nothing in the measurable environment that could reasonably explain total acoustic absorption. Even more unsettling was the behavior of the microphones. When positioned near the cave entrance and oriented inward, the background noise floor dropped dramatically, below what was considered physically achievable in open air. Normally, even remote wilderness contains micro-vibrations, wind turbulence, distant seismic hum, atmospheric noise. Here, those micro-signals faded into near-nothingness. It was as if the cave actively suppressed vibration in the surrounding airspace. The team attempted controlled movement experiments. A metal rod was struck against stone near the entrance. The impact was visible on high-speed cameras, yet the recorded audio barely registered a spike. Footsteps inside the threshold produced no measurable acoustic footprint. Even airflow from hand movements failed to generate detectable sound waves once crossing the invisible boundary. Communication became difficult. Two researchers stood only a few meters apart, one slightly inside the cave's shadow, the other outside. When the outer researcher spoke, the inner one heard faint fragments, distorted and hollow. When the inner researcher responded, the voice barely reached the outer microphones, dissolving into silence mid-transmission. The cave was not merely absorbing sound internally, it was disrupting sound propagation at its boundary. To eliminate human perception bias, the team launched a compact exploration drone equipped with independent microphones, vibration sensors, optical cameras, and signal repeaters. The drone hovered smoothly into the cave's interior while transmitting live telemetry. The video feed remained stable for the first few seconds. The walls appeared rough, ancient, untouched. Dust particles floated in the headlamp beam like frozen stars. But the audio channel collapsed almost immediately after entry. Not gradual fading, instant disappearance. Then telemetry began showing anomalies. Vibration sensors registered brief spikes that did not correlate with any visible motion. Internal gyroscopes reported minor orientation drift despite stable propulsion. The drone's distance measurements conflicted with visual scaling, suggesting spatial distortion or sensor misinterpretation. Within 30 seconds, the drone's signal strength degraded sharply. The repeater failed to maintain connection. The final transmitted frame showed a tunnel that appeared longer than physically possible based on entry angle and known geological models. Then the feed cut out entirely. Recovery attempts failed. The drone did not respond to recall commands. Its last known coordinates were mathematically inconsistent with the cave's mapped exterior dimensions. It had not crashed. It had not returned. It simply vanished from all measurable tracking systems. The team escalated testing cautiously. A fiber optic tether was extended into the cave, transmitting light-based data unaffected by sound. The cable advanced smoothly for several meters before resistance increased unexpectedly, not from physical obstruction, but from signal degradation. Optical clarity dropped despite intact cable integrity. Latency increased without detectable hardware damage. Even non-acoustic systems were being influenced. Some researchers began expressing discomfort, unrelated fear. Prolonged proximity to the cave produced subtle cognitive strain, difficulty focusing, delayed reaction times, mild vertigo, and distorted depth perception. Without sound feedback, the brain struggled to maintain spatial coherence. The silence felt mentally compressive, as though sensory information was being removed faster than the mind could compensate. One senior engineer voiced a disturbing hypothesis during internal discussions. Sound, he argued, was not merely noise, it was a carrier of environmental information. Reflections informed the brain of distance, texture, movement, and spatial boundaries. If a phenomenon could eliminate sound completely, it might also disrupt how reality itself was being measured and perceived. In other words, the cave might not be empty. It might be erasing signals. Every attempt to quantify the cave only confirmed its resistance to measurement. The instruments were not malfunctioning. They were being rendered irrelevant. The cave behaved less like a physical space and more like a blind spot in natural law, a region where established rules lost authority. The expedition's final report concluded cautiously. No existing geological model could explain total acoustic disappearance in open-air environments. No known material could absorb all frequencies without trace reflection. No atmospheric condition could suppress microvibrations to such an extreme degree. The cave represented a gap in current scientific understanding. Technology had reached its limit at the cave's threshold. And beyond that threshold, something unknown was waiting, untouched by sound, unseen by sensors, and indifferent to human attempts at control. When technology fails, only one question remains. What exactly have we been trying to listen to? The descent. No one volunteered immediately. After weeks of failed measurements, lost equipment, and unexplained sensor anomalies, the cave had earned a reputation among the research team that went beyond scientific curiosity. It was no longer merely an anomaly to be analyzed. It had become a presence, something that resisted observation, something that quietly rejected intrusion. Yet unanswered questions have a gravitational pull of their own. If machines could not penetrate the cave's silence, then human perception would have to take the risk. The proposal was carefully structured. A limited manned descent, no deeper than strictly necessary. Continuous biometric monitoring, redundant safety lines, independent lighting systems, visual-only communication protocols, no reliance on sound-based signals whatsoever. Every possible precaution was layered upon the plan, as if preparation itself could push back against uncertainty. 3 researchers volunteered. Dr. Elias Moreno, a senior geophysicist with decades of experience navigating unstable subterranean environments. Calm, methodical, and rarely influenced by emotional speculation. Dr. Hannah Reed, a cognitive systems specialist focused on human sensory adaptation under extreme conditions. She was deeply interested in how the brain responded when fundamental sensory feedback loops were disrupted. And Marcus Hale, a robotics engineer who had overseen the drone deployment and remained unsettled by its unexplained disappearance. He wanted answers that numbers alone could not provide. They suited up in silence, not because they were already inside the cave's influence, but because conversation felt unnecessary, even inappropriate, as if speaking might provoke something unseen. Their helmets carried cameras and biometric transmitters. LED light strips outlined their silhouettes like fragile lifelines against the dark. Fiber optic tethers connected them physically to the surface team, bypassing any reliance on wireless signals. At the threshold, the air changed. Not in temperature or pressure, instruments showed stability, but in texture. The air felt heavier, strangely resistant to motion, like moving through invisible syrup. The familiar ambient noise of the outside world collapsed behind them. Wind, distant birds, shifting equipment, all faded into an unnatural void within just a few steps. Their boots touched stone. They saw the movement, but they heard nothing. The absence of sound was immediate and absolute. Even their own breathing vibrated only faintly within their skulls, detached from the external world. Each exhalation felt trapped, internal, isolated. They descended slowly. The cave walls narrowed gradually, carved by ancient geological processes that now seemed irrelevant compared to the sensory distortion unfolding around them. Light beams stretched farther than expected, shadows lagging slightly behind movement, as if the cave resisted synchronization with physical reality. At 10 meters, biometric readings remained stable, though heart rates showed mild elevation consistent with cognitive stress. At 20 meters, subtle disorientation began. Depth perception became unreliable. Without echo feedback, distance estimation depended solely on vision, and the cave's irregular surfaces offered few reliable reference points. The researchers reported, via visual signal boards and hand gestures, a faint sense of spatial compression, as though the space around them was shrinking despite consistent measurements. Dr. Reed documented the sensation carefully on her wrist-mounted tablet. The brain, deprived of acoustic spatial mapping, was attempting to recalibrate, but the recalibration felt strained, forced, incomplete. At 30 meters, communication grew more difficult. Hand signals required direct line of sight. Light reflections behaved inconsistently. Occasionally, gestures appeared delayed or slightly misaligned with physical motion, an optical effect likely amplified by low contrast and visual fatigue, yet no one felt fully convinced by that explanation. The fiber optic tether remained intact, glowing faintly behind them like a thin artificial spine connecting them to the living world. At 40 meters, physiological anomalies emerged. Marcus's heart rate spiked briefly without physical exertion. Dr. Moreno experienced a mild tremor in his left hand that resolved within seconds. Dr. Reed reported an unusual cognitive sensation, a fleeting loss of internal timing, as if her perception of seconds had stretched or collapsed unpredictably. None of these readings justified aborting the descent, yet together they formed a pattern of subtle instability. At 50 meters, something changed, not externally, internally. The silence no longer felt passive, it felt structured. The absence of sound created a psychological vacuum that amplified micro-perceptions. The faint pulse in the temples, the friction of fabric against skin, the internal echo of thought itself. Without external auditory anchors, the mind turned inward, and the boundary between sensory input and imagination blurred. Dr. Reed later described it as standing inside her own nervous system. They paused. Visual boards flashed a synchronized halt signal. All three stabilized their posture and monitored their biometric displays. The cave ahead sloped gently downward into a broader chamber partially obscured by darkness. The geometry appeared inconsistent with earlier sonar void mapping, though no reliable spatial data existed for comparison. Marcus gestured toward a shadow that appeared to ripple slightly along the wall. Dr. Moreno shook his head slowly. Lighting artifact, he signaled, but none of them fully believed it. They advanced another 5 meters. That was when the tether tension shifted. Not a pull, not a slackening, a sideways deviation. The fiber optic line curved subtly toward the cave wall, as though influenced by a gentle lateral force. Surface monitors confirmed a minor directional displacement inconsistent with gravitational alignment or airflow. The tether corrected itself moments later, but the message was clear. Something in the cave influenced physical orientation. Biometric monitors recorded a synchronized spike in cortisol indicators across all three researchers. Stress response without obvious trigger. At 58 meters, the cave widened abruptly. The chamber opened into a cathedral-like void, ceiling lost beyond the reach of their lights. The floor dropped away in a shallow basin of uneven stone. Visual depth cues failed almost entirely. Shadows layered upon shadows, creating an illusion of endless recession. They stood at the edge. Dr. Reed raised a signal board. "We stop here." Dr. Moreno hesitated. Marcus stared into the darkness below longer than necessary. Against protocol, Dr. Moreno signaled forward movement of 1 additional meter for improved visual assessment. The surface team hesitated but acknowledged. They stepped. The chamber swallowed their light more aggressively than expected. Light diffusion patterns suggested abnormal absorption or scattering beyond known material properties. Dr. Reed's biometric feed flickered momentarily, not lost, but temporally misaligned by several milliseconds. Her internal clock readings desynchronized slightly from baseline. Then Marcus stopped moving, not frozen, not panicked, simply paused. His body remained upright, balanced, stable. But his eyes tracked something no one else could see. Dr. Reed signaled repeatedly. No response. Dr. Moreno approached within arm's length and placed a gloved hand on Marcus's shoulder. There was resistance, not muscular tension, not rigidity. It felt as though Marcus's body occupied a slightly different spatial alignment, a fraction of displacement that created subtle tactile mismatch. Dr. Moreno pulled back instinctively. Marcus blinked once. Then the tether connected to Marcus went slack. Not snapped, not detached, slack. As if the distance between Marcus and the tether anchor point had suddenly changed without visible movement. Surface monitors registered a sudden loss of positional coherence in Marcus's tracker, coordinates shifting rapidly beyond mapped bounds, then collapsing into null data. Dr. Reed's biometric feed spiked in panic response. Dr. Moreno signaled emergency withdrawal. They attempted to pull Marcus back manually. There was no resistance, no weight, no body tension, just empty line tension equal to air. Marcus Hale was gone. No displacement wave, no visual distortion, no sound, just absence. Dr. Reed staggered backward involuntarily, colliding with Dr. Moreno. Both stabilized quickly, training overriding shock. They reeled in the tether. The line returned intact, unbroken, leading nowhere. Surface team alarms triggered simultaneously. Marcus's biometric signal terminated cleanly, not degraded, not noisy, simply ceased as if the data source no longer existed. Dr. Moreno signaled immediate ascent. Dr. Reed complied, though her cognitive readings showed escalating disorientation. As they retreated, both experienced mild visual doubling and temporal lag effects. Movements felt delayed relative to intention, as though neural feedback loops were slipping. The chamber receded reluctantly, shadows closing in behind them. The cave did not pursue. It did not react. It simply remained, silent, waiting. They emerged into audible reality minutes later, the sudden return of sound crashing into their nervous systems like a sensory explosion. Wind roared. Equipment hummed. Human voices flooded perception with overwhelming intensity. Dr. Reed collapsed to her knees, overwhelmed by the sudden reintroduction of auditory input. Dr. Moreno remained standing, rigid, staring back into the cave entrance. Neither spoke for several seconds, because they both understood the same terrifying truth. Marcus had not fallen. He had not been taken by force. He had simply stopped being where reality could measure him. The cave had not swallowed him. It had erased his presence from detectable space. And whatever existed beyond that silent boundary was not constrained by the rules humans relied upon to survive. No return. The moment Marcus Hale vanished, the cave was no longer an anomaly. It became an emergency. Surface alarms erupted across the monitoring station. Biometric feeds collapsed into empty channels. Positional tracking systems flashed error codes as coordinates failed to resolve. Engineers shouted over one another, trying to determine whether the loss was technical or physical, whether the signal could be recovered or rerouted. But there was nothing to reroute. Marcus Hale's data stream had ended with surgical precision. No interference noise, no corrupted packets, no gradual degradation. 1 second it existed. The next, it did not. Dr. Moreno and Dr. Reed were pulled back beyond the cave threshold immediately. Medical personnel rushed forward, scanning vital signs, stabilizing cognitive shock, flooding them with auditory and visual grounding stimuli. Both showed elevated stress markers, mild neurological disorientation, and temporary sensory overload. Neither could initially articulate what had happened. There were no words that fit. The cave entrance remained unchanged, dark, still, indifferent. Within minutes, the site transitioned into full emergency response mode. Additional safety officers arrived. External authorities were notified. All experimental testing was suspended, pending rescue evaluation. The question was unavoidable. Could Marcus be retrieved? Rescue doctrine demanded action unless survival probability was mathematically negligible. But the cave did not behave like a conventional environment. There was no collapse, no toxic exposure, no visible entrapment. There was only disappearance, a condition rescue protocols were not designed to address. The first recovery attempt involved extending the fiber optic tether deeper than Marcus's last known position. Engineers reinforced the cable with tensile monitoring sensors, redundant signal repeaters, and independent power feeds. The line advanced smoothly into the darkness, meter by meter, glowing faintly against the stone. At 58 meters, the same lateral deviation appeared. Not forceful, not random, deliberate. The cable curved slightly off-axis as if nudged by an invisible current. Sensors registered no mechanical stress, no obstruction, no detectable field influence. Yet the displacement persisted until the cable was withdrawn. The tether returned intact, no resistance, no damage, no evidence of contact. The next attempt used a specialized retrieval drone designed for confined, hazardous environments. Unlike the previous exploration drone, this unit was equipped with autonomous navigation algorithms, high-intensity optical mapping, and physical grasping arms capable of retrieving equipment or human remains. It crossed the threshold. The audio channel failed instantly. Visual feed remained stable longer than expected, nearly 40 seconds, revealing the familiar narrowing tunnel and widening chamber beyond. But depth mapping algorithms struggled to construct coherent geometry. Surfaces appeared to stretch subtly between frames, violating consistent spatial continuity. As the drone approached the chamber basin, its orientation telemetry destabilized. Gyroscopic readings drifted despite constant motor output. Internal clocks desynchronized slightly from surface systems, introducing millisecond-scale latency errors. Then the signal degraded. Frame rate dropped sharply. Compression artifacts flooded the display. The drone's positional data spiked beyond logical limits, distance estimates exceeding physical constraints of the cave. Then everything stopped. The drone did not crash. It did not disconnect gradually. It vanished. Two machines lost inside the same invisible boundary. Still no trace. A third attempt used non-invasive probing methods. Laser range-finding systems projected light pulses into the cave interior. Unlike sound, light should have reflected reliably off solid surfaces. The initial reflections were consistent near the entrance, but beyond a certain depth, the return signals weakened unpredictably, scattering into incoherent patterns that could not be reconstructed into stable geometry. Light, too, was being distorted. Not absorbed completely, but destabilized. It was as if the cave contained a region where coherent measurement itself began to unravel. Psychological strain mounted across the team. Engineers argued quietly over whether continued attempts increased the risk of further loss. Safety officers questioned whether the environment constituted an active hazard zone beyond acceptable exposure limits. Ethics advisors raised concerns about sending additional personnel or equipment into a space that demonstrated unpredictable erasure behavior. Dr. Reed remained under observation, but insisted on reviewing the telemetry logs personally. She identified subtle temporal anomalies in the data, micro desynchronizations between independent clock systems that could not be explained by latency or hardware drift. Time inside the cave appeared slightly misaligned with external reference frames. Not enough to measure cleanly, enough to matter. Dr. Moreno refused to return inside, not out of fear, but out of clarity. The cave did not respond to intervention. It did not resist, threaten, or attack. It simply removed whatever crossed a certain boundary condition. You could not rescue what no longer existed within measurable reality. The decision was made 72 hours after the incident. All recovery operations were terminated. The cave site would be sealed. Physical barriers were installed at a safe perimeter distance. Warning systems activated automatically for unauthorized proximity. Satellite geofencing registered the location as a restricted anomaly zone. Access permits were revoked indefinitely. Marcus Hale was officially declared missing, presumed lost under anomalous circumstances. No body was recovered. No remains were located. No physical explanation was accepted. The final investigation report avoided speculative language, but its implications were chilling. The cave exhibited behavior inconsistent with known geological, acoustic, electromagnetic, or atmospheric models. Multiple independent sensor systems experienced coherent failure patterns beyond random malfunction. Human exposure correlated with neurological disorientation and spatial instability. The environment represented a non-classifiable hazard. Translation: stay away. But even after sealing, the cave did not release its grip on those who had witnessed it. Dr. Reed experienced recurring perceptual disturbances for months, brief moments of auditory dropouts in quiet rooms, phantom spatial distortions when standing in darkness. Her brain had adapted temporarily to a world without sound cues, and the adaptation refused to fully fade. Dr. Moreno withdrew from field research entirely. He returned to academic work, but avoided underground environments, not from fear of caves, but from distrust of spaces that concealed too much from measurement. The research team archived the raw data under restricted access. Requests for further investigation were denied. Funding agencies quietly classified the project as closed, yet the cave remained, silent, unchanged, untouched. No one knew whether Marcus Hale still existed in any meaningful sense, whether he was alive, displaced, suspended, or erased completely. The data offered no answers. The cave had taken something and returned nothing. In the absence of evidence, the human mind does what it always does. It fills the void with possibility. Some believed Marcus had crossed into an unknown physical dimension where conventional sensory signals could not reach. Others suggested localized space-time distortion, a natural blind spot in reality's fabric. A few whispered about consciousness itself being entangled with sound, and that the cave stripped awareness from matter. None of these theories could be tested, because no one was willing to cross that boundary again. The cave did not threaten humanity. It did not announce itself. It did not expand. It simply existed, a quiet reminder that not all environments are meant to be understood, and not all disappearances leave behind a trail to follow. Some doors once crossed do not lead back, and some silences are not empty. They are closed. What could silence mean? When the cave was finally sealed and the last monitoring equipment powered down, what remained was not closure. It was uncertainty. Science thrives on patterns, repeatability, and measurable cause and effect relationships. Phenomena become understandable when they obey predictable rules. The silent cave obeyed none of them. It offered no stable variables, no reliable feedback loops, and no consistent framework within which meaningful experiments could continue. All that remained were fragments of data, partial observations, and human experience. Yet within those fragments, unsettling questions began to emerge. What is sound, truly? At its simplest, sound is vibration, pressure waves traveling through matter, carrying energy from one point to another. But for living organisms, sound is far more than mechanical motion. It is spatial awareness. It is proximity detection. It is the invisible architecture that allows brains to map the world beyond what eyes can see. Echoes define distance. Reverberation defines enclosure. Subtle frequency shifts reveal movement, texture, and density. Long before language existed, sound taught organisms how to survive in darkness, avoid predators, and navigate unseen terrain. In humans, sound anchors reality. Remove it, and perception begins to drift. The silent cave did not merely eliminate noise. It erased the environmental feedback that tells a nervous system where it exists in space and time. Without that feedback, the brain loses one of its most reliable reference systems. Depth becomes uncertain. Motion becomes ambiguous. Even the internal sense of timing destabilizes. Dr. Reed's cognitive data suggested that prolonged exposure to the cave altered neural synchronization patterns, not dangerously, but noticeably. The brain attempted to compensate for missing sensory input by amplifying internal signals, heightening imagination, memory fragments, and subconscious pattern detection. In silence, the mind grows louder. But what if the silence itself was not passive? Some researchers quietly speculated that the cave did not simply absorb vibration, it converted it. Energy does not vanish, it transforms. If sound energy entering the cave was being redirected into an unknown channel, where was it going? Heat measurements showed no significant increase. Structural resonance showed no accumulation. Electromagnetic sensors detected no conversion spikes. The energy was leaving measurable reality. One controversial hypothesis suggested that the cave intersected a physical region where wave-based information decoupled from conventional space-time geometry, a natural blind spot in the fabric of measurable dimensions. In such a region, vibration could pass into a state that no longer interacted with matter in familiar ways, not destroyed. Translated: if true, sound entering the cave might persist elsewhere, carrying with it encoded information about its origin. Every spoken word, every footstep, every heartbeat sent into the darkness might still exist, simply beyond human detection. That raised an unsettling possibility. If information could cross that boundary, could matter follow? Marcus Hale's disappearance offered no measurable confirmation, but the coincidence was difficult to ignore. His vanishing aligned precisely with the boundary where acoustic coherence collapsed completely. If the cave functioned as a transfer threshold rather than a void, then crossing it might relocate physical presence into a domain where conventional sensors could not operate. Not death, displacement. Another hypothesis approached the problem from a biological perspective. Consciousness itself relies heavily on sensory feedback loops. Perception constructs reality by continuously updating internal models based on incoming signals. Remove enough of those signals, and the model destabilizes. In extreme sensory deprivation, humans experience hallucinations, dissociation, temporal distortion, and loss of self-boundary. The cave represented an externalized version of that condition, a zone where sensory input was actively stripped away. Perhaps the cave did not move Marcus physically. Perhaps it disrupted the informational structure that defined his presence within shared reality. A more conservative interpretation suggested that unknown geological structures might be creating extreme acoustic absorption combined with subtle electromagnetic interference, producing cascading sensor failures and cognitive stress responses. But this explanation struggled to account for the consistency of disappearance patterns, temporal anomalies, and spatial distortions observed across independent systems. The cave behaved less like an environment and more like a filter, filtering what could remain in our world, filtering what could not. Silence, in this context, was not emptiness. It was a boundary condition, a threshold where familiar rules ceased to apply. Human civilization has always feared silence for symbolic reasons: the silence of deep space, the silence before disaster, the silence of abandonment. But biologically, silence represents vulnerability. Without sound, organisms lose early warning systems. Predators approach unseen. Environments become unpredictable. The cave magnified that vulnerability to an existential scale. It stripped away humanity's ability to verify existence itself. Perhaps the most disturbing realization was not that the cave defied explanation, but that it did so effortlessly. It did not exhibit intelligence, intention, or hostility. It simply existed according to rules that humans did not share. The universe is under no obligation to be comprehensible. The cave may represent a reminder that perception is not reality. It is merely a filtered interface shaped by evolution to keep organisms alive, not to reveal truth. When that interface fails, reality does not disappear. Only our access to it does. Somewhere beneath those mountains, the cave remains sealed, its interior unchanged by human curiosity. No sound enters now, no voices test its boundary, no machines attempt to map its emptiness, yet the silence continues, waiting. Whether the cave is a doorway, a defect in space-time, a natural anomaly beyond current physics, or something entirely unknown, one conclusion remains unavoidable. Silence is not the absence of something. It is the presence of limits, limits of perception, limits of measurement, limits of understanding, and sometimes limits of return. The final thought. We often believe that darkness is what frightens us most. The absence of light triggers ancient instincts, warning us of hidden threats and unseen dangers. But darkness still allows imagination to work, still offers shapes, shadows, and movement to interpret. Silence is different. Silence removes confirmation. It strips away the subtle feedback that tells us where we are, how far something lies, and whether we are truly alone. In silence, the world loses its edges. Space becomes uncertain. Time stretches or compresses without warning. Even our own presence feels fragile, as though it could fade without resistance. The silent cave reminds us that fear does not always come from what attacks us, but from what refuses to respond at all. No echoes return from its depths. No measurements resolve its shape. No evidence explains what crossed its boundary and failed to come back. It does not threaten. It does not chase. It does not communicate. It simply remains indifferent to human curiosity and untouched by human logic. Perhaps that is what makes it unsettling. Not the idea that something waits inside, but the possibility that nothing we understand waits there at all. Somewhere beneath layers of stone and time, the cave continues to absorb every vibration that dares to approach its threshold. Every unanswered question remains suspended in that silence, unresolved and unreachable. The world above continues to move, speak, and listen, unaware of how thin the boundary between certainty and uncertainty truly is. We search for meaning in noise, patterns in signals, and safety in explanations. But occasionally, reality offers no answers, only limits. Limits of perception, limits of knowledge, limits of control. And in those limits, humility is born. The cave does not need witnesses. It does not require belief. It exists regardless of attention, quietly reminding us that the universe contains spaces where human understanding cannot follow. So if you ever find yourself standing before a place where nothing echoes back, where even your own voice disappears without trace, remember this: silence is not empty. It is the space where our certainty ends.
Shadows crawl where the light won't go. A